The morning Angela Brooks walked into the Walker Technologies headquarters on Michigan Avenue, the city was still cold and gray, the kind of gray that settles over Chicago in late October, like a second skin. She paid the taxi driver in cash, declined the receipt, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk with a worn leather briefcase hanging from one hand and a paper cup of black coffee in the other. No town car. No assistant. No advanced team of publicists arranging the lobby before her arrival. Just a woman in a charcoal blazer and flat shoes, looking up at a 40-story glass tower as if she were memorizing every inch of it before she went inside. Angela was 42 years old. She had rebuilt failing companies in Detroit, in Atlanta, and in Phoenix. She had walked into rooms that did not want her and walked out of those same rooms carrying the keys. She had learned, over 2 decades of fighting for a seat at every table that tried to exclude her, that the most valuable intelligence a leader could gather was the kind that came before anyone knew they were being watched. That was why she had told no one at Walker Technologies what she looked like. That was why she had asked the chairman, Richard Caldwell, to hold her formal introduction for the first board meeting rather than announcing her arrival in advance. She wanted to see the company as it truly was, not as it performed when leadership was present. She had done this before. It never failed to tell her exactly what she needed to know. She pushed through the revolving glass door and crossed the lobby toward the elevator bank. The building smelled like recycled air and printer toner. A security guard barely glanced up from his desk. 2 women in marketing walked past talking about a budget deadline without making eye contact with anyone around them. Angela pressed the button for the 32nd floor and watched the numbers climb. The elevator opened onto a wide open-plan office, humming with the particular quiet of people who were working hard but not happily. She stepped out, oriented herself quickly. Corner offices to the left, conference rooms along the far wall. A cluster of department heads gathered near a glass-walled room, with a projector screen already lit, and began to walk. She had gone no more than a dozen steps when she heard the voice. It came from her left, sharp and carrying, the kind of voice trained to project authority across a room. "Hey, excuse me." She stopped and turned. Daniel Harper was standing in the doorway of his office, one shoulder leaning against the frame, arms crossed over his chest. He was 48, with the build of a man who had once played college football and the expression of a man who had never entirely stopped believing in the rules of that game. He looked at Angela, the way certain men look at things they have already decided do not belong in front of them. His eyes moved from her shoes to her briefcase to her face, and something settled into his expression, a kind of comfortable certainty. "You looking for someone?" he said. Not a question so much as a checkpoint. Angela met his gaze. "I'm in the right place," she said simply. Daniel pushed off the doorframe and took 2 steps toward her. "This is the operations floor. Executive suite. You sure you've got the right floor?" He was not loud. He did not need to be. Several nearby employees had already stopped typing. A young man near the printer had gone very still. "I'm sure," Angela said. Daniel's mouth curved slightly at the corners. It was not a smile. "See, we've had issues before with vendors coming up without clearance. Or sometimes the cleaning service sends people up early." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "Maybe you want to check in downstairs?" Behind him, 2 managers exchanged a look. One of them made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but close enough. Angela did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She shifted her briefcase slightly in her hand and said, "My name is Angela Brooks." Daniel tilted his head. "Right. And you're here because I have a meeting in that conference room," she said, nodding toward the glass-walled room at the end of the hall. Daniel's smile widened. "I don't think so. That's a board-level meeting. Very restricted." He turned toward the security desk. "Marcus, can you come check this visitor's credentials?" The guard at the desk stood up, uncertain. A handful of employees were watching now, some pretending not to. Angela stood completely still. Not rigid still, the way still water is still. Her eyes moved around the room quietly, cataloging faces, noting who looked away and who held her gaze, who seemed uncomfortable and who seemed entertained. She was still gathering intelligence. Daniel turned back to her and said, quietly enough that it functioned like a whisper meant to be heard, "We run a professional environment here. This isn't really the place for." He let the sentence hang unfinished, which was worse than finishing it. The implications settled over the floor like smoke. That was when the door to the large conference room opened, and Richard Caldwell, chairman of Walker Technologies, stepped into the hallway. He was 61, silver-haired, and he had the look of a man who had already seen everything in the world and found most of it predictable. His eyes found Angela immediately, and he walked toward her with his hand extended and his face doing something it rarely did at work. It was beaming. "Angela," he said, "we've been waiting for you." He shook her hand with both of his and turned to the floor to Daniel, to the watching employees, to the two managers who had exchanged that look, and said with perfect composure, "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Angela Brooks, your new Chief Executive Officer of Walker Technologies." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that falls when a room suddenly understands it has been watching something it cannot take back. Daniel Harper stood 3 feet from Angela Brooks and did not move. His arms were still crossed. The color that had settled in his face moments before the warm, confident pink of a man in his natural element had drained to something closer to white. The two managers near the printer had stopped exchanging looks. The young man by the copier had set down his papers and appeared to have forgotten about them entirely. Angela turned to face the room fully for the first time. She was not smiling. She was not frowning. She was simply present, composed, attentive, taking everything in without performing anything for anyone. Caldwell was still speaking, his voice moving through the basics. Angela's background, her track record, the board's unanimous decision. He mentioned the 3 companies she had turned around. He mentioned the industry awards she had quietly declined to publicize. He mentioned the specific metrics she had achieved in Phoenix, which had been the most dramatic transformation in the sector in the past decade. None of this appeared to register for Daniel. He was still standing in place, as if his feet had fused to the floor. When Caldwell finished speaking, Angela stepped forward, not toward Daniel specifically, just forward, into the room, into the space that was now hers, in a way it always had been, and he had simply refused to see. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was the same as it had been in the hallway even, measured, carrying without effort. "I know I'm arriving without much fanfare, and that was intentional. I prefer to see a company as it actually runs before I start making changes." A pause. "This morning has been informative." That last sentence did not land like a threat. It landed like a fact, which was somehow heavier. Daniel uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor, then at Caldwell, then at a point slightly to the left of Angela's shoulder. "Miss Brooks," he said, and already the title had cost him something. She could see it in the way his jaw worked before the words came. "I was simply following protocol for unannounced visitors, I understand," Angela said. She looked at him directly, without hostility, which was worse for him than hostility would have been. "We can discuss your protocols later." She moved past him toward the conference room. At the threshold, she paused and addressed the floor one more time. "I'll be meeting with each department head individually over the next week. In the meantime, please carry on." She went inside. The door closed behind her. The floor exhaled in a dozen different ways. Some people turned back to their screens too quickly. Some stood still a moment longer. Some disappeared into side offices. Brianna Cole, a mid-level analyst in operations, sat at her desk near the window and pressed her hands flat against her keyboard and did not type anything. She was 34 years old, had been at Walker Technologies for 6 years, and had spent most of those 6 years learning how to make herself very small in rooms where Daniel Harper was large. She had watched the entire exchange from 15 feet away. She watched it and felt something happen in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope. In the days that followed, Angela moved through the company like water finding its level. She was in early and stayed late, but she was not performing industriousness. She was reading the building the way she had learned to read every building she'd ever been handed. She read it in the way employees moved through the hallways, in the particular silence that fell when certain managers walked by, in the lunch patterns and the after-hours emails, and the quality of the explanations she received when she asked simple questions about workflow. She requested the internal HR files on her second morning and spent 3 hours reading them in sequence. The numbers were not subtle once you looked at them plainly. Turnover among Black and Latino employees in the operations division was 2.4 times higher than in any other group. There were 9 formal complaints filed over the past 3 years, all of them involving the same division, 6 of them referencing the same manager by name, and all 9 had been logged, reviewed, and closed without action within 30 days. Angela set the files in a neat stack on the corner of her desk and sat with her hands folded on the table for a long moment. She had seen this before, in different companies in different cities, and it always looked the same, not chaos, but order. A very deliberate order, designed to keep certain things from becoming visible to anyone with the authority to do anything about them. On Thursday of her first week, she went down to the building's cafeteria at noon and got in line like everyone else. She carried her tray to a table near the windows, where a group of operations staff were eating together. She sat down and said, "Mind if I join you?" There was a half-second of recalibration around the table, the instinctive wariness that employees carry into any interaction with an executive, and then a woman named Patricia slid her bag off the chair beside her, said, "Of course." They talked about the food, about the commute, about whether the parking situation on the third sublevel was ever going to get fixed. Angela listened more than she spoke. Near the end of lunch, an older man named Marcus, the same security guard who had stood up from his desk on her first morning, set his tray down at the end of the table and nodded at Angela with something careful in his expression. "You're really going to fix it?" he asked. Not combative. Not hopeful exactly. More like a man who had been promised things before and was trying to decide if this time was different. "I'm going to try," Angela said. He nodded slowly. "Been here 19 years, he said. "First time I've seen a CEO eat in the cafeteria." He picked up his fork and didn't say anything else. That evening, returning to her office, after a 2-hour walkthrough of the IT department, Angela found a message in her secure inbox from an anonymous sender. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained a single PDF attachment and no other text. She opened the attachment and read through it twice, then a third time. It was a summary, methodical, clearly assembled by someone who knew the system well, of 6 months of budget transfers in the operations division. The numbers did not add up in the direction they were supposed to add up. Angela closed the file, opened it again, and began to take notes. The financial records of Walker Technologies' operations division were not, on the surface, alarming. That was by design. Whatever had happened to the money, and something had clearly happened to it, had been arranged with a practiced hand, distributed across enough line items and vendor accounts that a casual review would have moved past it without slowing down. But Angela was not a casual reviewer. She had spent 4 years early in her career as a forensic consultant before moving into executive leadership, and she still approached financial structures the way she had then, not looking for what was there, but looking for what was missing, for the shape of the absence. She brought in 2 trusted members of her own team, both of whom she had worked with in Phoenix, and the 3 of them spent a weekend in the Walker Technologies server room going through 18 months of operational expenses line by line. By Sunday evening, they had found it. Not all of it, and not yet with enough specificity to take to a board. But the outline was clear: vendor contracts awarded without proper bidding, consulting fees paid to entities that did not appear to have provided consulting services, expense reports that had been approved at a level that should not have been approving them. All of it traced, in one way or another, back to the operations division, back to Daniel. Meanwhile, Daniel was moving too. He had spent the week since Angela's introduction working the phones, calling board members he'd known for years, meeting for drinks with a director named Jeffrey Marsh, who had made no secret of his skepticism about the chairman's choice of CEO. He framed everything carefully. The company was destabilized. The new leadership was inexperienced in the sector. Employees were confused. He did not say Angela's name more than he had to. He let the implications build on their own. In a full department meeting on Wednesday of the second week, he stood up and said, in a tone of careful reasonableness, "I think we'd all agree that effective leadership requires operational understanding, not just vision, but process. And a company this size cannot run on sentiment." Angela was in the room. She had been quiet for most of the meeting. She let the sentence finish, let it sit for a moment in the air, and then said, "You're right that a company can't run on sentiment. It also can't run on a culture where people are afraid to speak. Those aren't the same thing, and I'd encourage you to be careful about conflating them." Daniel sat down. But she could see, in the set of his shoulders as he did it, that he was not finished. There was a version of Angela's life in which none of this had happened, in which she had taken the safer job after graduating at the top of her class from the University of Illinois, the one at the mid-sized firm in suburban Evanston, the one where the hiring manager had shaken her hand warmly and told her she was exceptional and said they would be in touch, and then never called again, in which she had spent the years between 22 and 30 in the kind of professional limbo that swallows talented people when the systems around them refuse to work the way they are supposed to, the specific frustration of being capable and invisible at the same time, of doing the work, and watching the credit migrate to the person who most resembled what credit was supposed to look like. Her mother, Dolores, had cleaned offices in the Loop for 23 years. She had worked the overnight shift in at 10, out at 6, home before the morning traffic thickened, moving through lobbies just like this one, with a cart and a keycard, and the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to complete her work without anyone noticing she was there. Dolores had never complained about this to Angela. Not once, not ever, not even in the shorthand way that exhausted people sometimes speak without finishing sentences, trusting that the listener already knows the rest. She had not given Angela the narrative of her difficulty. She had given her something harder and more valuable, the example of dignity maintained under conditions designed to erode it. Angela had understood, from an early age, that this was a gift, and she had treated it as one. She had done everything right: the grades, the degree, the certifications, the internships that paid nothing and asked for everything, the early mornings and late nights, and the way she had learned to walk into rooms and not let what she saw in people's eyes change her posture. And still, at 24, a senior partner at a consulting firm had looked at her across a conference table and said, with the particular kindness of a man who believes he is being helpful, "You're impressive, Angela." Genuinely. But leadership at this level, our clients here are accustomed to a certain type of interface, and I worry you'd be creating friction you'd have to spend energy managing. She had not cried in the office. She had walked to her car, sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes, and then driven home and written in her journal for 2 hours. Not about the injustice of what had been said to her, though the injustice was real, and she knew it, about what she was going to do with it. She had learned, in those years, to use everything. Closed doors became structural material. Every dismissal clarified her purpose, because every person who told her she could not do something was giving her information about why she needed to. She had taken positions other people did not want, in companies other people had stopped believing in, and she had done the work no one else was willing to do. And she had done it with such consistency, over such a long time, that eventually the weight of the evidence became impossible to argue with, even for people who wanted to argue with it. She thought about all of this when the work got heavy. She thought about it sometimes when she was alone, in the way that people revisit the foundations of a building while they are standing inside it, not to dwell there, but to know that the ground holds. She thought about it on the evening she met with Brianna in the small conference room on the 31st floor, the one with the broken projector that no one had gotten around to fixing. Brianna was not a naturally nervous person. Angela had seen that much in the way she moved and spoke at her desk, with a directness that was being actively suppressed by her environment. But she was nervous that evening, sitting with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. She told Angela about the presentation she had spent 4 months completing, the market analysis Daniel had taken into a leadership meeting and presented without her name on a single slide, the one that had earned him a commendation while Brianna sat at her desk on the 32nd floor typing the meeting minutes. She told it plainly, without embellishment, watching Angela face for signs of whether any of it was landing. "You are not the first person to tell me something like this," Angela said. Brianna nodded. She had figured as much. "Why did you stay?" Angela asked. Brianna was quiet for a moment. "Because leaving felt like letting him win," she said. Angela held that. "I did not come here to go after Daniel Harper specifically," she said. "I came here because this company is worth saving, and the people in it are worth more than what they have been given. Those two things are connected." Brianna looked at her across the table. "But you are still going to do something about him." It was not a question. "Yes," Angela said. "I am." She thought about that conversation now, sitting at her kitchen table with the global offer in front of her, and what she kept coming back to was the face of Marcus saying 19 years, and meaning it had taken 19 years for someone to sit at his table, and the weight of that number, and what it asked of her. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week, Brianna arrived at the IT department's main office at 7:45 and found the 2 data analysts she worked with, Most closely, a man named Kevin and a woman named Sasha, already at their stations, both of them wearing the particular expression of people who had been awake since very early and were running on adrenaline. Kevin turned when he heard the door. He deleted it, he said. Most of the vendor files from Q2 and Q3. Sometime between 11 last night and 3 this morning. Brianna set down her bag. All of it? No. That's the thing. Sasha was already pulling up a directory on her second monitor. He deleted the documents. But the system logs the deletions. And we have the security camera footage from the server room. Brianna pulled up a chair. Play it. It was 41 seconds of grainy overhead footage from a camera mounted above the server room door. 41 seconds of a man in a dark jacket and an access badge moving through the room, sitting at a terminal, working with focused efficiency. The timestamp in the bottom right corner read 2:47 in the morning. The face was clear. Sasha leaned back in her chair. Also, Kevin said, the recovery team got about 70% of the deleted files back. They're on the secure drive. Brianna stared at the frozen frame on the screen for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and sent a single message to Angela's private number. 3 words. We have it. The board meeting was called for a Thursday afternoon, and Angela had been in the building since 6 in the morning. She had reviewed the recovered files again, confirmed the chain of evidence with the IT team, spoken privately with 3 employees who had agreed to provide statements, and sat for 40 minutes in her office, doing nothing but thinking. The room filled at 2 o'clock. 12 people around the long table, board members, senior executives, the legal team, and Daniel, who arrived last and took the seat farthest from Angela, which put him at the opposite end of the table from where he normally sat, a distance that seemed to be both physical and otherwise. Richard Caldwell opened the meeting formally and then nodded to Angela. She stood. She did not begin with the financial evidence. She began with the first slide, which was a graph, a simple, clean graph of employee turnover rates by division and demographic group over a 36-month period. She let people look at it for a moment without speaking. Then she moved to the second slide, which showed the 9 HR complaints, their dates, their subjects, and their resolutions. Or rather, their non-resolutions. The third slide was a timeline. Angela narrated it quietly, naming dates and figures, describing the pattern of vendor approvals and payment authorizations. She cited amounts. She cited dates. She cited names. On the fourth slide, she played the video. The room watched the 41 seconds of footage in complete silence. When it ended, she advanced to the financial recovery documents, the 70% that had been retrieved, and placed them alongside the summary that had been emailed to her anonymously in her first week. They matched. Not perfectly, because nothing in a cover-up matches perfectly, but in the ways that mattered, in the directions that money had moved and the places it had disappeared to, they matched. When she finished, she sat down. The silence in the room was not the silence of the first morning. That silence had been shock, the kind that passes. This silence was the kind that comes after understanding, when a room recognizes that something it has been comfortable with has been made permanently uncomfortable. Jeffrey Marsh, the board member, who had been most publicly skeptical of Angela's appointment, had not moved in several minutes. Across the table, 2 of the other board members were leaning together in quiet conversation. Daniel Harper was looking at the table in front of him. He had not looked up during the video. He had not looked up during the financial section. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the carrying quality it had in the hallway on that first morning. It was smaller now, and harder, and frightened, in the way that sounds like anger. This is selective, he said. This has been assembled to make me look. The documents are complete and unaltered, Angela said. The IT team can walk through the chain of custody if the board would like. Marsh spoke from the other end of the table. Daniel. Just the name. Daniel's mouth closed. Brianna, who was not in the boardroom but was sitting in the operations floor bullpen, along with most of the department, watched through the glass wall as Daniel Harper stood up from his chair, 30 minutes after Angela had begun speaking, gathered nothing because he had brought nothing, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle and turned back to Angela. You did this, he said. His voice was almost quiet. You came in here and you... No, Angela said. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward. She sat exactly as she had been sitting. I turned the lights on. What was under them was there before I arrived. Daniel opened the door and walked out. From the bullpen, the employees of Walker Technologies Operations Division watched their department head walk through the floor for the last time, past the printer, past the cluster of desks, past the spot near the elevator, where he had stood on a Monday morning and told a woman in a charcoal blazer that she did not belong here. No one said anything. Marcus, who was on duty near the elevator, held the door open. Daniel walked in. The doors closed. In the days after Daniel's termination, the company felt different in a way that was hard to articulate precisely, but that nearly everyone in the building noticed. It was in the small things, the way people spoke in meeting rooms, the slight loosening of posture in hallways, the increased eye contact, the fraction of a second longer, that people held doors open for one another. A woman named Diane in accounting told her team lead that she had filed an anonymous concern the week before and had actually expected it to be read, and had been surprised by how that expectation alone had changed something in the way she sat at her desk each morning. 3 employees from the operations division submitted detailed written accounts of incidents they had witnessed or experienced under Daniel's management accounts they had been sitting on for months or years, some of them for the full duration of Daniel's tenure, waiting for a moment when the telling would not cost them more than the silence had. A junior developer in IT named Rashid told Kevin, quietly, over bad coffee in the break room, that he had been thinking about leaving for 2 years and was now reconsidering. None of this was a transformation. A company does not transform in 3 weeks. It was the beginning of the possibility of one. The first cautious movements of people who had learned to be very still, suddenly testing whether motion was safe again, the way ice tests a surface, before committing its full weight. Angela worked. She continued to work the way she had always worked, which was without theater and without announcement. She hired an interim operations manager, a woman named Carolyn with 20 years in manufacturing logistics, who had the rare and valuable skill of being able to be simultaneously demanding and humane, a combination that was rarer in management than it had any right to. MB. She redesigned the HR complaint process so that submissions were reviewed by a rotating committee that included non-management employees alongside HR professionals, eliminating the single reviewer structure that had made it so easy, for so long, for complaints to disappear. She commissioned an independent audit not just of the finances, which were already under external legal review, but of the promotion and performance review processes, looking for the structural patterns that allowed individual bad actors to function undisturbed for years, the invisible architecture of permission that made someone like Daniel possible and sustained. For Daniel Harper, the world outside Walker Technologies was not gentle. The financial investigation had been referred to the company's outside legal counsel, and there were conversations happening in rooms he had no access to about numbers he had spent 2 years making difficult to find. At home, the evenings were quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. His wife, Sandra, was not cruel. She was not the type, and she had loved him for 21 years through various versions of himself. But she was present in a careful, watchful way, and the dinner table had a quality of restraint that Daniel could not remember from before, as though everyone at it was waiting to see who he would turn out to be when the job was no longer holding him in a particular shape. His son, Marcus Jr., who was 19 and home from his second semester of college, had been told what had happened in general terms, and had taken to spending his evenings in his room in a way that communicated without words a kind of recalibration, as though he was revisiting things from childhood under a different light and finding them altered. One evening, Daniel sat in the kitchen after midnight with the lights off. He was not doing anything. He was just sitting in the dark with his hands on the table, and for the first time in a very long time, he thought about the morning 3 weeks earlier. He thought about the woman with the briefcase and the paper cup of coffee, standing in the middle of that floor while he said the things he had said, and the way she had not flinched. He thought about what that must feel like, to walk into a room and be seen as a problem before you have spoken a word, to have to decide, in the space of a few seconds, how to carry yourself through the particular humiliation of being judged as lesser by someone who has not earned the authority to judge you at all. He thought about his mother. Briefly, she had worked in a hospital laundry for 30 years, and he had grown up watching her put on a uniform every morning with quiet pride, and somewhere along the way, he had decided that the lesson of her life was about dignity. But he had learned the wrong version of it, not the dignity of doing honest work with full presence, but the dignity of never being the one in the uniform. He sat with that for a long time in the dark kitchen. Meanwhile, Richard Caldwell called Angela into his office on a Wednesday afternoon and slid a document across the desk without saying anything first, which was how he communicated things he was uncertain about. The parent company, he said, once she had picked it up. They want to formalize what they've been watching. Angela read the first two paragraphs. Then she read the third and fourth. It was an offer for the global CEO position, a role that oversaw Walker Technologies, along with 4 other companies in the conglomerate, reporting to the international board. A position that came with the kind of resources and visibility and reach that she had been building toward in one form or another since she was 22 years old and a senior partner had told her she would create friction. She set the document back on the desk. "I'll think about it," she said. She went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table for a long time, and the city moved outside her window, and she thought about who she was and who she had promised to be, and what those two things asked of her right now. Angela did not sleep well that night, or the night after. The offer was real. It was serious money, serious responsibility, the kind of platform that mattered. She had spent her entire career earning exactly this. But she had also spent the past 3 weeks looking into the faces of people who had been waiting, some of them for years, for someone to come and do what she had started to do, and she was not finished. She was not close to finished. She thought about Marcus, the security guard, eating in the cafeteria and asking her if she was really going to fix it. She thought about Brianna, sitting across from her with a cold cup of coffee, talking about staying because leaving felt like letting someone win. She thought about her mother, Dolores, getting home at 6 in the morning to make breakfast for a daughter, who had watched her move through the world with extraordinary dignity and had made a decision, early, about what to do with that example. On a Thursday morning 4 weeks exactly since she had first walked through the lobby of Walker Technologies, Angela received a message that Daniel Harper had asked to speak with her privately. She considered the request for the better part of an afternoon. Then she sent back a single word, "Okay." They met in the small conference room with the broken projector. Daniel looked like a man who had been sleeping poorly and eating less. He was wearing a jacket she had not seen before. Not his work jacket, something older, from before the job had defined his wardrobe. He sat down across from her, and for a moment did not speak. Angela waited. "I wanted to say that I'm sorry," he said. "Not because of what happened at the board meeting. I mean," he stopped and started again, which was clearly difficult for him, and the difficulty was genuine. "I treated you in a way that was wrong. On your first day. The way I spoke to you. I've been thinking about it." Angela held his gaze. "You assumed I didn't belong there," she said. "Yes. You assumed that based on what you saw?" "Yes. Have you thought about why?" The question was not an attack. It was clinical, the same direct, examining quality she brought to financial documents or organizational charts. Daniel's jaw worked. "I think," he said slowly, "I think I was afraid. I didn't understand that at the time. But I've had time to think. And I think I spent a long time in that job making sure I was the one who decided who belonged. Because as long as I was doing that, I wasn't the one who could be told I didn't." He exhaled. "That's not an excuse. I know that." "No," Angela said. "It's not." She was quiet for a moment. People who need to diminish others to feel secure are always afraid. That doesn't make the diminishment acceptable, but it does explain it. She looked at him. "I won't tell you I forgive you. That's not something I can do in a meeting room in a month. Forgiveness isn't fast and it isn't simple, and I won't pretend it is." Daniel nodded. He had not expected differently, and the fact that he hadn't, that he sat with her words without flinching away from them, was perhaps the first genuinely honest thing she had seen from him. "What I will tell you," Angela said, "is that the only version of this that means anything your apology, your sitting here, any of it is if you actually change. Not in the abstract. In specifics. In how you treat people who have less power than you. For the rest of your life, regardless of whether anyone is watching." She stood. "That's the only redemption that's real." Daniel stood too. He did not put out his hand. She did not put out hers. He said, "Thank you for seeing me," and walked out. The following Monday, Angela called a company-wide meeting in the main atrium, all floors, all divisions, the whole machinery of Walker Technologies, standing together in the large open space that spanned the lobby and the first mezzanine level. She stood at the front without a podium, without slides, without notes. She spoke for 18 minutes. She told the company what she had found and what she was doing about it. She described the new complaint and review process, the independent audit, the restructuring of the operations division. She announced 3 new programs, a leadership development track that would draw specifically from non-management employees who had been historically passed over for advancement, a compensation transparency initiative that would make salary band information available to all staff, and a formal mentorship program pairing senior executives with mid-level employees who had demonstrated ability and been denied opportunity. She announced that Brianna Cole was being promoted to Director of Operations, effective the following week. A sound moved through the atrium when she said this. Not applause, exactly more like a collective exhale, a shifting of weight, the sound of a room deciding it was safe to feel something. Angela looked at the faces in front of her at Marcus near the security desk, at the analysts from IT, at the junior developer who had been thinking about leaving, at the woman from accounting who had filed the anonymous complaint. She looked at Patricia from the cafeteria table, who was standing near the back with her arms crossed and something new in her expression. I want to say one more thing, Angela said. Not as your CEO, but as someone who has spent 20 years in environments that told her she didn't fit, and who made a decision to change those environments rather than learn to live inside them. She paused. Every person in this building deserves to come to work and be seen accurately, not through the lens of someone else's assumption or fear or comfort, accurately. That is the baseline. That is not a special program or an initiative. That is the minimum that a decent workplace owes to every person who walks through its doors. She did not raise her voice at the end. She did not reach for crescendo. She simply stopped speaking, and the room was quiet, and in the quality of that quiet was something that Walker Technologies had not had in a very long time, or perhaps had never had. After the meeting, as people filed out and back to their floors, Angela stood at the edge of the atrium and accepted greetings from employees she had met and some she hadn't, and she shook hands and listened, and made notes for later. As the atrium cleared, she walked toward the main entrance, where a new framed statement had been mounted on the wall beside the building directory that morning, installed by the facilities team at her request. 4 words in clean, dark type on a white background. Not a slogan, a standard. She stopped and read it for a moment, though she already knew what it said. Leadership begins with respect. Marcus was standing nearby. He was not on duty. He was heading out for his lunch break, but he had slowed as he passed the frame. He stood beside Angela for a moment, reading the same 4 words. 19 years, he said quietly. Angela nodded. She did not add anything to that, because nothing needed to be added to it. On the day they had first met, Angela Brooks had walked into a building that was not ready to see her for what she was. She had been stopped, questioned, and publicly diminished in the space of 5 minutes by a man who wore authority like armor because underneath it he was hollow. She had stood still and let it happen, not because she had no recourse, but because she understood that the best thing she could do in that moment was see it clearly, remember it accurately, and use it. She had used it, not as a weapon. She had never wanted a weapon. She had used it as evidence, as data, as one more piece of the picture of a company that had lost its way, not through any single dramatic failure, but through the slow, daily accumulation of small cruelties that went unnamed and unchecked, and eventually became the culture itself. She had spent her career walking into those cultures, naming the cruelty, checking it, building something else in the space where it had been. She had declined the global role, because there were still floors in this building she had not walked, still faces she had not yet learned, still work she had promised and not yet delivered. She would take the next opportunity when the time was right, and she would carry with her everything she had learned here about the people who had trusted her, about the systems that could be dismantled and rebuilt, about the particular courage required to tell the truth in a room that has invested in the lie. She walked out of the atrium and took the elevator to the 32nd floor. The doors opened. The floor was full and working, humming with the particular energy of people who are engaged rather than afraid. The sound of a place beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to breathe. Angela walked through it to her office, set her briefcase on the desk, and opened the day's first file. There was always more work. There was always more work, and she had always been the person most willing to do it. Outside the glass walls, Chicago was bright and cold. The city went on being the city. And in a 40-story building on Michigan Avenue, something was quietly and genuinely changing, not because it had been commanded to, not because a directive had come down from above, but because one person had walked through a door and refused to be made invisible, and then had stayed and done the work and earned the room. That was how it had always happened. That was how it happened now. Angela Brooks had not set out to become a symbol. She had set out to do a job, to take a broken system and replace it with something functional and fair, to find the people who had been overlooked and give them the conditions to show what they were capable of, to build the kind of organization where performance was actually the metric rather than the performance of performance. She had done that work before, in other cities, in other towers of glass and steel, and she would do it again after this. But this one had asked something particular of her, because it had started on that particular morning, in that particular hallway, with that particular man looking at her as though she were a problem to be removed, rather than a person who had arrived. She did not think about Daniel often, in the weeks after. She was too busy. But when she did, she thought about the kitchen he had described sitting in, alone at midnight, in the dark, beginning the slow and painful work of becoming someone different from who he had been. She did not know if he would manage it. She did not know if the apology he had offered her represented the beginning of genuine change, or was simply the last performance of a man who had always performed strength and was now performing contrition. She had told him the truth. Only the living of a different life would answer that question. She could not answer it for him. Nobody could. What she knew, what she had always known, and had built her life around knowing, was that organizations do not change because someone gives a speech. They change because somebody stays and does the work and makes the change real in the details, in the process documents, in the promotion decisions, in the way a manager speaks to the person who brings bad news, in whether the security guard at the front desk feels like a human being at work or a piece of furniture. She had stayed. She was doing the work. Outside, Chicago was moving through its afternoon, the lake visible from her office window, cold and gray and permanent, doing what it always did regardless of what happened in the buildings along its shore. Angela turned back to her desk. There was a file open in front of her, the first review from Carolyn, the interim operations manager, documenting the initial findings from the restructured performance review process. The early results were promising, not dramatic, promising, which was exactly the right word for something that was genuinely beginning. She picked up her pen and started reading. Behind her, the city went on, indifferent and enormous and full of buildings just like this one, full of people, just like the ones on the 32nd floor, people who came to work every morning and did their best in whatever conditions they had been given, and who deserved better conditions than most of them had ever been offered. Angela knew she could not fix all of it. She had never believed she could. What she believed, what she had staked her entire professional life on, was that one building at a time, one policy at a time, one person treated with actual dignity on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. The conditions changed. Not fast, not cleanly, but they changed. That was enough to keep working. That had always been enough.